Welcome, it's Ben Lewing here at the Early Intervention Foundation. Thank you for joining us for our latest webinar. I'm here with Chris Tuke.
Hello, yes, I am in fact Chris Tuke. Yes, Chris Tuke, and I am from the DWP and I'm working with them on this Reducing Parental Conflict Programme.
And we will guide you through the webinar talking about a range of things. We are going to excuse me a moment, we're just moving through the slides. So we're going
really
to
smooth, yeah.
very slick, yes. We're going to cover this over the next 40 minutes or so. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Reducing Parental Conflict Programme and strategic leadership support, and Chris will do that. And then I'm going to take you through the Reducing Parental Conflict Planning tool, explaining what it is and what it's for, and then talk you through how you can use it as part of strategic leadership support. And then we will come to the Q&A part of the agenda. So if you have a question as we're moving through, then you can submit your question at any time. We won't come to them until the end when we'll work through the questions, but anything that you want to ask of us, if you submit it any time during our presentations, and we'll come to those at the end. Okay, so Chris, over to you.
Okay, so we thought it would be useful just to give you a little bit of background to the Parental Conflict Programme. What I'm not going to do is to go through all the detail and a lot of the evidence, but I just wanted to touch on that. And then there's plenty of websites and places you can go to get all the information that you need. So we'll send you to that later on. So just to say, the Reducing Parental Conflict Programme, the vision and purpose of it is quite useful to remind ourselves of this. And it's got a wide vision and a real sense of purpose. So whilst today we're talking about the planning tool, a document we've got to do and a process we've got to fill in, it fits into a really broad range of things that the programme is trying to do. So here, just let me read out the programme vision and purpose. Is to help avoid the damage that parental conflict causes to children. And by 2020-21, proven parental conflict support will increasingly be embedded in local support for vulnerable families in England. And this whole programme is being highly evaluated as well. So what we're going to be talking about today fits in with that whole programme and with the evaluation proposals and plans that we've got across the programme. So again, it's worth just touching on the fact that this programme has got a whole load of policy history to it. Again, I'm not going to go into loads of detail about that, but it's really important that the work that we're talking about today, albeit a small element of it, fits into quite a long history of work and investment that has been happening across the country and building on that evidence base. So it's important to make that connection. And again, just a couple of things to highlight for you. There's a really strong evidence base that others, including the Early Intervention Foundation, have been bringing together and developing. And it's important that this work is set in that context. And we do know that there's a strong evidence base that conflict between parents, whether those parents are together, whether they're separated, can have a significant and negative impact on children's mental health and long-term life chances. So, and again, if there's one thing that really crystallises what we're doing, it's that this matters. It's important for us to, as organisations, to address this issue, to understand this issue, and that's what this programme is all about. And the context is really focusing on improving those life chances for children. The website address is just there at the bottom. If you don't already know it, some of you may be really familiar with what the Early Intervention Foundation and the programme have been doing. Some of you may be new to this and you've come across this webinar or the recording. So go to that website and you can get a lot of the information and the evidence and the background to them. So just to remind you then, again, you may already know this, But there's 4 key strands to the Parental Conflict Programme. There's some face-to-face support, which has been commissioned, and just on the right of that slide, you'll see the cluster areas, or contract package areas as we've called them, where some face-to-face interventions have been commissioned and are being delivered over the next couple of years. It's not everywhere, and we know there are lots going on, but that, as part of this programme, is what's been commissioned there on the right. So that's face-to-face support 1. Secondly, the Innovation Fund and Challenge Fund. A lot of work has been going on around there to focus some funding around innovation, digital, and around work that's going on in local areas. And then finally, the local strategic strand of the programme, which is a little bit more about what we're talking about today. So we want to talk about the strategic grants that have been given to local authorities. And part of the work is to help local authorities bring together the activity that they're doing to help address parental conflict and support parents and families. And there's a practitioner training element to that, which many of you will be familiar with. And there's some specialist parent conflict training as part of that. So again, this local and strategic integration is a really important part of the wider programme. And today, we want to talk about how we're using this planning tool to support that strategic leadership support. I think that's probably me, isn't it?
Not quite.
Oh, yes, I've got a couple of other things there. So before I hand over to Ben, I thought it was useful just to go over a couple of questions and some of the discussions that I've been having, certainly with local authorities, as we've looked into this planning tool and planning how we're going to do it. So just to clarify a couple of key points, why do we have to do this? So the planning tool that's been designed by the EIF is a really important way for us as a programme to work with local authorities and their partners to start to measure and quantify and qualify what's going on across local authorities. And it's really important for this to be happening. We've given a deadline of the end of June to do this first piece of work using the planning tool, and then we're going to do that again at the end of February. So it's really important that you know this will be making a difference in informing decision making and the evaluation and analysis of the programme as a whole. It's not just about filling out a form to get something done. It's a really important part of the fabric and a part of the plan of the overall programme. So again, as I've said, we've got to be having completed this tool and the summary return, but Ben will talk a little bit more about that later, by the end of June. And again, just to add, before I hand over to Ben, it's really important that this is something that's done across your partnerships, potentially with families as well, involving those to reflect on where you are as a partnership and what's going on in your local area around addressing parental conflict. So it's something that's collaborative, and it's something that's really important as part of the wider elements of the programme. Okay, so is that you now? I think it is. Oh, that was slick.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the planning tool now. First of all, it's a new tool. It was commissioned by DWP to help you with introducing the Reducing Parental Conflict Programme at a local level. Many of you may be familiar with our maturity matrices. It's part of that family, that suite of tools that are designed to support people in your roles in decision making, planning, designing, commissioning early intervention services at a local level. It's all about generating discussion, differences of opinion, helping you to build a full picture of different perspectives on where your system is at the moment and how to improve it. And it helps with building consensus about what you do to make improvements. It's good at mapping your current arrangements for identifying areas of strength and areas of development. And it gives examples of what you might expect to see at different levels of progress. So as I've mentioned, it's part of a wider suite of tools. You may have seen our others. Our original one looked at 0 to 19 early intervention systems. We've also published matrices that are focused on the early years, on gangs and youth violence, on language and communication. And you will probably be familiar with some of the structure that was used for troubled families measurement as well. They draw on the same set of core principles and examples published by other organisations such as the Good Governance Institute. So it's a fairly tried and tested approach to support planning. We've also used the experience of working with over 30 local areas across the different matrices, more than that now in fact, to help design the content as well as the structure. So it should feel like something that for many of you is both familiar, but also connects well with the things that you're thinking about at a local level. You've got some quotes in this slide which show how people have used it on an ongoing basis. So to set a baseline and then go back to it to look at whether they've made progress, and also to help with some of the challenge conversations at a local level. That people have used it to question whether the things that they assume are actually understood and recognised across their partnership, or are they making progress in all the right areas that make the biggest difference for families. This is what the Reducing Parental Conflict Planning tool itself looks like. It's all about the whole system. So whether that whole system is pulling together to reduce parental conflict, it has 4 dimensions: plan, lead, deliver, and evaluate. And each of those is broken down into key elements, which you can see in the slide. I'm not going to go through each of them now, but I did just want to explain a little bit about the progress levels. So this matrix or planning tool has 5 progress levels, unlike some of our other tools, because we've introduced an entry level progress level, because this feels in many places like a very new policy agenda. Sure, there are some areas that have been pioneering and making strides on reducing parental conflict, but in other areas it just feels very new. And what we wanted to do with the entry level was to show people some of the foundations that you're likely to already have in place that you can build on, even if you haven't been talking about parental conflict previously. So if you've been thinking about a whole family approach in your strategy, if you already have a partnership that brings together the range of people with an interest and a stake in local family services, these are things that would mean that you are already at the entry level and you can build on those. The other levels then move you gradually through stages of development. First steps is where you've recognized the importance of tackling parental conflict and there's a local commitment to action, but you haven't necessarily started yet. Actually, taking the first steps through strategic leadership support means that in many of these areas you would consider yourselves at first steps, because you're seriously thinking about what you can do at a local level to respond to parental conflict. Early progress is when you've started work on these key elements and you're starting to see some signs of bringing partners together to make things happen at a local level. Substantial progress is when you're seeing some initial results and you're starting to see that in terms of family experience as well. And mature is when you've been around this a couple of times. Your strategy, for example, will have been through a number of iterations. You've improved it based on what you learned from your previous work on the strategy. You've taken a lot of feedback in the approach that you've been using and adapted as a result of that. And often others are seeking to learn from your experience. Most areas actually avoid scoring themselves at the mature level because there's always more to do. But actually there are areas that have been learning and experimenting for a longer period of time on parental conflict than others. And much of what they do would now be considered mature. So I want to say a little bit now about how you use the matrix, the planning tool rather, as part of your strategic leadership support. We have constructed 2 ways of using the planning tool, and they're detailed in the slide. And I want to explain what the difference between the 2 is. So,
do you want to just make a comment for those people just on the phone? This is all explained on the website, isn't it? I'm just conscious that some can't see the slides.
That's true, yes. So essentially what we're doing is taking you through the process now that is detailed on our website. So if you do have access to a computer but are listening to us on the phone, you may want to have a look at the Reducing Parental Conflict Hub, where this is described in a bit more detail. And obviously we'll share the slides afterwards with everybody. And also we will publish a recording of this. So if you've enjoyed it so much first time around, you want to watch it again, you'd be most welcome to. So the two options, the first is that we are offering an online survey which is built around the planning tool, which we think you would need to follow up then with a half-day workshop. The idea of this is that you collect together some of your key stakeholders to complete the online survey version, and then you use their individual responses to inform the content of that half-day stakeholder workshop. The reason that we're offering this is because it can be a really good way of getting some of your key stakeholders familiar with the methodology and thinking about reducing parental conflict across all the dimensions in the planning tool before they turn up on the day of the workshop. Actually, it helps people move forward more quickly if they've been doing some detailed thinking about this before they sit down with their colleagues in the multi-agency workshop. It also gives you some content that you can use to prepare for the workshop, to make sure that you're focused on the issues that seem most challenging, the issues that are already coming through as a priority. So it helps you be prepared. And in our experience, it just accelerates the conversations that you can have, hence suggesting a half-day workshop. The second option then is that you don't do the online survey, but you just bring your key stakeholders together for a full-day workshop. Often people bring together a stakeholder group that involves anything between 20 or 40 stakeholders. I mean, it may be different in your local area. That's for you to judge who has an interest in reducing parental conflict, or who has an influence on reducing parental conflict and just hasn't realized the role that they need to play yet. What we would suggest is that your stakeholder workshop should bring together a wide span of stakeholders to help respond to the breadth of services that this agenda touches on. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you might structure the second approach. But the reason that you might choose the full day workshop rather than the online survey and half-day workshop is because you want to reduce the upfront work. You may want to avoid identifying that handful of 10 to 15 key stakeholders to do the work up front, and you feel that you perhaps have sufficient understanding of the agenda for people to be able to take this forward just using the full day workshop. So it reduces the preparation time, but our view is that you probably need to have a longer workshop to get through the material that the matrix covers, the face-to-face time. So I'm going to take you through each of those options in a little bit more detail now, and I'm going to start with the online survey and half-day workshop. And as Chris pointed out, the detail on this process as you move through the steps is also described on our website. So the first step is to have a look at the website. That's where you register. You can find all of the information that we're covering on the Reducing Parental Conflict Hub. And there is a key role here for a local coordinator. So there should be one person from each area who takes on the role of coordinating the relationship with this work. Who does the registration and who makes sure things keep moving on. So for that person, they, on our website, choose the option that they want to pursue, either the online survey and half-day workshop or the full-day workshop. So there's a button that they click, which says register for whichever option they're choosing. The important thing here is that by clicking on that button, you are triggering the process. So the clock starts as soon as you click register. Now, all of this is explained on the website so that you're aware what you're signing up for when you click the register button. But it's important to stress that when you send in the information, and you can see an example of the form that you need to complete on the right-hand side of this slide, you are starting the clock and it triggers the process. All the information that you need to submit is that your contact details, so the name, email address, role, and the local authority area that the coordinator is responding on behalf of, and then to submit that. In response, you will get an automated email or message which describes again what the process is, explains the steps that you're going to take, gives you a link to the online survey, and sends you an example template for the workshop. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the workshop agenda a bit later on, so rather than going into it now. So once you have received that information, what you need to do is get it out to your 10 to 15 stakeholders. What we would say there is that, as I've mentioned already, be ready to send it out straight away, because once those 21 days are up, we will collate the data that's been submitted and return it to you. So we're not able to respond to extensions for another week and so on. It's a case of when you're ready, let us know, and then you've got 3 weeks to submit your data from across your stakeholder group. The reason that we suggest 10 to 15 stakeholders is because you have fewer, then you tend to get quite a diverse spread of opinion, which in one sense is good, but you don't get so much consensus. So you tend to get outliers and you don't see a pattern. If you have more than 15 stakeholders, then people tend to say the same sorts of things. It just generates a lot of work for you. You don't need to include everyone at this stage. You just need a representative group, and we suggest between 10 to 15 stakeholders. What's important is making sure that they are representative of the wider set of interests. So choose a mix of people who have a strategic perspective or an operational perspective. So people who understand how commissioning works and how strategy is decided at a local level is important. But you also need people who are more familiar with the experience of families and understand how services are connecting together and have different insights. The key thing here is to get that spread of perspectives on your local arrangements. Now, some people will be keen to get it done, but just struggle. So you'll probably need to do some chasing to send people reminders. You may need to help some people to complete the survey. It's not a quick job, actually, doing the survey. It's not something you can glance through in 10 minutes, done. It takes about 30 minutes. So it does require each person to have some dedicated time to work through it. And certainly for those who are new to this agenda and haven't seen the planning tool before, it may take them a little while to read it through and understand how it's structured. So after the 21 days are up, as I said, we will collate the data that's been submitted from across those 10 to 15 responses, and we will return it to the local coordinator in a spreadsheet within 5 working days. So we will get the data back to you within a quick turnaround, but it's worth recognizing this will be data. So we're not sending you a fancy report. We are returning to you the individual comments and ratings that your stakeholders have put into the system. It's not a format that will work well for you to share with your wider stakeholder audience. People will have said the same things as each other. Sometimes it will be hard to understand what people have said because it speaks to their interest rather than to a wider audience. It's going to need some filtering so that you can use it to produce a summary report which you can then share with your wider stakeholder group. And we have a template example that you can use if you choose to, that summarizes the quantitative numbers, so how people have scored each of the dimensions, and also gives you some structure to put in some of the key comments. The sorts of things that people are asked to comment on in the survey are why they've picked a particular rating, so what evidence supports the rating they've given, and also what action they think needs to happen next. So those are things which are really important for telling the story about your local system, but you will need to do some filtering of the qualitative information that people have sent back through the online survey.
And in fact, it's using SurveyMonkey, isn't it? So
that's right.
So you'll be familiar with that software anyway.
So shortly after the return to you of the data, we suggest that you bring your stakeholders together. Obviously, you will have let them know that it's happening and invited them, and it's a wider set of stakeholders than those which completed the survey. In this timeline, you can see we've suggested a couple of weeks after getting the return to you. It's entirely up to you. Actually, you might want to leave more time so that you can work on your summary report. I guess the main issue here is leaving sufficient time so that you can make sure that you're ready, but not leaving so long that it feels like the responses are a little bit out of date, or people have forgotten what it was that they submitted. Okay, so in terms of the workshop itself, we suggest that you run it in a way that that you would run any form of workshop that's going to allow good discussion. So key things are things like natural light, plenty of space, small table group discussions, giving people the opportunity to really listen to each other, as well as structuring it with plenaries so people can hear wider group discussions. Really think about it as an opportunity for generating discussion. And it's most successful where you include the dissonant voices. Don't think about this as a way of controlling the message. Think about it as a way of generating wider discussion. The structure for the agenda then helps participants to understand why reducing parental conflict is important, to reflect on the online survey responses before having that discussion that I talked about, to seek consensus across the group about where they're at now and what next. This is the template agenda that we share with you. It's entirely up to you what you cover in your workshop. In fact, you can run it over 2 days if you so wish, but what we're suggesting is that this is the kind of content that you might want to use if you're doing it on a half day. So first of all, it seems to help to have your senior responsible owner or your senior champion to give a mandate for these discussions, to express how important this is and why the wider partnership of stakeholders with an interest here are committed to it. Then we suggest it is important to follow up with some of the narrative that Chris touched on, actually, which is what the evidence says about reducing parental conflict, why people are talking about this now. So having someone who is familiar with the evidence, either from within your organizations or an independent expert, to just talk about the latest evidence, in particular, why parental conflict, has such an impact on children's lives, feels like a really important part of setting the scene. In fact, what we find is that often people are not ready to talk about the elements of the planning tool until they've already heard and had a chance to think through what this agenda is about, why it's important, why people are talking about it, and what the evidence says. So actually, you may want to leave a little bit more time up front for the discussion of the evidence and people's understanding of it, depending on how much your local stakeholders have talked about this before. Then what we suggest is that you probably, the local coordinator, introduces the planning tool and says what it is and the process that you followed so that people are familiar with it. And in fact, in the information that you send out beforehand, it's worth sharing a link to the planning tool, which is available online, so people can go and have a look at it beforehand. The next two parts of the agenda are structured around discussion around the components of the planning tool. So what we're suggesting is that you lead some content which explains the individual responses that were collected through the online survey across a couple of the dimensions in turn. So for an hour or so, talking about what people said in their individual responses about plan and lead, and then having a discussion about that. So asking people about whether they recognize that narrative, whether it is the local story that resonates with them, or whether there's something missing. Do they agree with how people have rated the local area? And what do they think are the priorities for action? So doing that in individual table groups, but then getting people feeding back their views, having a plenary so people can listen to each other. The second part then is looking at the third and fourth dimensions, so deliver and evaluate, and having the same structure. So some upfront content from your local coordinator explaining the individual responses, and then some structured discussion where people can work that through. The key thing here, again, not to close down discussion by saying this is how it is. All that you get from the online survey responses up front is individual responses. It's a single person's view on this system, when actually the system is too big for one person to see it all. It depends on a wider spread of perspectives. Then what we suggest is that you draw this discussion together with some kind of prioritization activity. We've seen this done in different ways in different areas. Some areas have used Slido, which is an online version for table groups to put forward their ideas so that they can be seen across the whole group. Other areas have been less high-tech and just gone with flip charts and post-its, but used the whole group to hone in and to refine down to key priorities. It just seems to work best when there's a sense of ownership of the priorities. But also you can bring some examples, things that have already come through for people to discuss, to get the discussion going. But the key thing does seem to be wider ownership of priorities for change. And then we suggest that you conclude by having that senior mandate again to recognize what people have done during the day, to talk a little bit about next steps, and to confirm the journey that you're on, because clearly the workshop is about setting up the work that follows rather than concluding it. Then the final stage of this process is for you to take the conclusions of the workshop and put them into a spreadsheet and return it to DWP. In fact, the return to DWP is a requirement of the Strategic Leadership Support grant. But more importantly, it's just a crucial part of the process. If we are to generate some momentum on reducing parental conflict, then we need to have a sense of the journey traveled, the distance traveled in individual areas. We want to have a feel for the things which people think are priorities. And it also helps DWP and the EIF and others to tailor the support offer to you. So it's really important that you send in your return, which tells us about your priorities for change and where you think you're at now. It's also the baseline against which you will compare yourself when you look at the planning tool again in February, as Chris was talking about.
Yes, the end of February, March, yeah.
So for areas that choose to go this route with the online survey, the spreadsheet will be similar to the spreadsheet that you received with the data from the online surveys. So it will have the same content. So you can choose just to cut and paste, but the chances are that you will want to include the discussions that you had in your half-day workshop. That's the point of bringing your stakeholders together to add to that story. And also the original spreadsheet will have 10 to 15 individual responses in it, all with different ideas about the ratings and the evidence. So the return that you send to DWP is your conclusions on all of the discussion that you've had before. It is your attempt to tell a single story about where you're at and what you're going to do next. So more briefly now, I'm going to move through the second option, which is avoiding the online survey altogether and just holding a full day workshop. So again here, there's an explanation about the choice that you're making and why you might choose this version compared to the online survey, which I talked about already. You have a similar registration form which asks you for the same contact information, but also when you're planning on running your stakeholder workshop. The key thing here is to note that that you're expected to hold your first workshop and make your return to DWP by the end of June. Is that right?
Indeed, yes. Yeah.
So that'll be the options that are contained in the example form that you can see on your slide. So here, when you register through the website, so the same route in the Reducing Parental Conflict Hub, you will get a similar message in response as to the other route that I've just described previously. But it confirms that you've registered, and you will be sent an agenda template for the workshop, which is slightly different. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The whole point of this multi-agency workshop, as with the previous one, is to generate small group discussion, to engage that wider set of stakeholders, and for people to work through each of the 10 key elements confirming the local rating. So, as I've said before, there's just something about taking a little bit more time as you work through the planning tool in this version to agree your ratings, because people won't have thought about this before necessarily. Here's the template agenda that we suggest for a full day workshop. Much of it is the same as with the half day workshop, so an introduction from a senior local leader, something which talks about the evidence. Again, you may want to extend that section so that it allows more time for discussion, an introduction to the planning tool. But then what we suggest is that you take an hour for each of the 4 dimensions of the planning tool. That may seem a lot of time. In practice, you will run out of time because people will have a lot to say. They will want to work through the detail, and it's complex stuff. So an hour moves by very quickly. When we first started working with matrices like this and running whole day workshops, people struggled to get through all of the content. The Reducing Parental Conflict planning tool is a pretty concise version of previous versions that we've used before. Nonetheless, the richness of this is in the discussion, so we would recommend that you leave plenty of time for that discussion and building consensus. Then after those sessions, we suggest that you have a similar prioritization activity, so involving everyone in building consensus about where you start and what you do next, and then the conclusions and next steps as described by your senior champion for this work. Then again, as with the previous version, you need to complete the spreadsheet, which you will have been sent. That's one of the documents that's available to you both through the website and sent to you in the information we provide. You need to return that to DWP so that they can monitor progress against this, tailor support, and check on national progress, the national story that I talked about before.
And actually, just worth reiterating, the sheet that goes back to the DWP is a short summary. It's not the dialogue of the whole day and the record that you're going to want to keep. It is just a short summary, so we don't need you to be repeating a whole lot of work. But again, that short summary back to the DWP helps us as you say, get that single narrative and that summary from each local area, but not all of the post-its that may well be generated on that day.
Yeah, don't send your post-its. But that's a good point, Chris. So we will guide people. Less is definitely more when it comes to returning the spreadsheet, because there's just something about the concise picture across the country about the things that people are wanting to do, the challenges they're facing, and of course progress between these 2 points. So the completion by the end of June, and then progress by February. So I know that some of you have been submitting your questions as you go, which is terrific. You can still do so, and we will come to those in a moment. There are a couple of resources that we wanted to point you towards before we do. The first is that we have published some frequently asked questions just to help people through some of the practical issues of using the planning tool and applying it on strategic leadership support. We will continue to add to that. So we will take the questions from today, for example, if they're not covered yet in the FAQs, and we will grow that. Obviously, there's no such thing as a stupid question. This is a process that we've created to try and help you, but a lot of it will feel new and quite technical. So please do come back to us if there are further questions. The 2 routes to do that: if it's a technical issue about using the process and applying it, then you can get in touch with EIF through the rpc.planningtool inbox. If you have practical issues about engaging local stakeholders or how to make strategic leadership support work, you can also turn to your regional integration leads, and who they are, if you don't know already, are listed in the Reducing Parental Conflict Hub. The link is in the slide here. Chris, I don't know whether you want to say a bit more about that?
Yes, I think it's worth adding that each of the integration leads are there to support you, help build this process and design it, and to help you through that. Some of the events they may well be able to attend, obviously certainly not all, we can't attend 150 workshops around the country, but there may be some of those that we can offer some support and presence to, or on presentations, and get involved with you. But again, we can't get involved in all of them, but absolutely we want to be right there helping you get this organised and sorted. Such an important part of the process for us, so that's what we're here to support.
Just to say that I guess it's a similar issue for EIF. We are getting an increasing number of requests to come and speak at local events, to talk about the evidence, to help people with their planning work. We have unfortunately very limited capacity to do that, but it's helpful for us to know the sorts of things that you're interested in, the kind of support that you need, because we can make that available through the Reducing Parental Conflict Hub, whether it's checklists or briefings and so on. There's a huge amount of information already in the hub, so that's a good place to start. But please do let us know if there are other things that would be useful. Okay, we're going to come to the questions now. First of all, from Natasha Jones, do DWP have generic promotional material we can adapt, please, for working?
That is a good question. The short answer is no. Obviously, the Early Intervention Foundation have a number of really useful briefings and papers that you can download, print, and hand out as part of a package or part of an offer. I think one of the reasons we haven't suddenly created loads of printing and flyers is because areas are doing their own thing, and they've got things that are more aligned with their own activities. So we've kind of thought that local areas would be adapting and developing their own materials to suit their own needs, rather than us sort of centrally creating things. So do have a chat with me, Natasha, if I can add any more about that. But we haven't printed any sort of flyers and promotional materials, but we can share some slides with you. And as I say, there are things that you can download and use to hand out, particularly to professionals, rather than parents and families themselves. Yeah.
So a couple of resources that spring to mind straight away. We have published 2 workforce briefings, one targeted
really
for people working for local government, another for people working in the NHS. So they're worth having a look at. You can find them in the hub. It may be that you want to use some of that content, but you don't need it to be specific to those audiences. You can adapt those. We also have published a short animated video which talks about this agenda, what the evidence tells us and why it's important for children and families. So that may be something that you'd want to use as an introduction to one of your events. There's a range of resources in the hub. And again, just to reiterate, if there are things which would be useful additions, or indeed if you have adapted materials and you think they would be useful for a wider audience, send them in to us, get in touch, let us know.
But definitely in terms of the collaboration, police, health, voluntary sector colleagues, and I've found those briefings are really helpful to engage different sectors of different organisations and different teams. So really important that partners are whoever they need to be, who's working with families, who's working with children, schools. Let's not forget schools. So again, they're dealing a lot with the children and those behaviours that children and young people are struggling with. So involving schools, voluntary sector, health, police, absolutely get as many as you can round the table and involved in the process. So there was a good question there about whether we've got an email. We can help with the email to stakeholders. Is that something that is part of the process? I'm looking at you, Ben. So, you know, the email that you might send to your stakeholders saying, this is what we're doing, come to this event. Maybe something we could explore around that or share.
We could. I think the information that is that we've provided so far might essentially be what you need. It's worth having a look at that and see whether that's sufficient. And we haven't got a template email for you to just send out. I guess see how you get on with the information that we've shared at the moment, and then if you need more, the message is tell us what would be useful to you.
You don't want it to sound too formal. You want it to be part of what you're doing in your area and personalise it. So let's see where we go with that. There's
something about the pitch, actually. Knowing the people that you want to influence, pitching it right to them. So a template email might be helpful, but might not really be what you need. Okay, so next question. Is there an option 3 from Lynn Shine?
Lynn, hello, Lynn.
Can we tie it into what we are already doing? I'm always enthusiastic for a third option. That's a great idea. The key thing here is to reach the end point where you've generated discussion with your local stakeholders and you're able to let DWP know about what progress you've made. So you're building your local strategy. That's certainly an option. I think essentially that's a bit like the second option. So so although it may not be a multi-agency workshop because you're doing it in a different way, if you can show, my view anyway, if you can show that you've connected with your key stakeholders, they're thinking about this, that you've responded with a coherent way of engaging people, then fine. Yeah,
it's got to make sense. Got to make sense for you.
Okay. What level, another one from Lynn, what level in the partner organisations do you expect people to be able to contribute inform the planning tool? There are 2 stages in the process. I guess if I take each of them in turn, if you're using the online survey, I've already talked a little bit about making sure that people are bringing different perspectives. So helpful to have people who are commissioners or strategic leads or heads of service who are operating in that local strategic environment. Also good to involve people who have an operational perspective. The reality is people will find some of the questions in the survey hard to answer because they just don't see that part of the system. And that's absolutely fine. We make it clear in the survey that some bits of this may not be your experience of the local system. And don't worry about it, move on to the next question. Let someone else who understands that part of it know more. I mean, a classic with this is people who are in operational roles just not cited on what the commissioners are doing and don't know how that's developing. But that's fine. You know, it does need a broader set of perspectives to answer all of the questions. One of the things which I think is super interesting is when families themselves or someone bringing a family perspective are involved in the process. Now, clearly that's crucial to the wider stakeholder workshop, but sometimes there are people who are used to representing family interests in this strategic context. You know, they may be sitting at a children's partnership board, they may be part of your early help work, and they might be willing and able to look at the planning tool. I guess the issue is whether they are used to using something which might feel quite organisational and technical, and not giving them something that would be a big leap from the kind of language they usually use. So it's worth having a look at the planning tool itself and deciding whether you've got people who can bring that family perspective as well as the organisational perspective. Whichever way you approach it in the survey, crucial that family voice is heard in the workshop itself.
Yeah, and the whole process is about collaboration. It's about involving other partners and perspectives, and health visitors, and, as I say, schools, and it'd be great to see examples from authorities that can appropriately engage parent voice and even some voices from children and young people, just where you've got avenues to do that already. And so they're bringing in that collaborative level to this, certainly for the end of June deadline, but also for February. Again, you've got a second chance at this later on, early next year. So again, what you haven't been able to do for June, you can go and do for February. So I'm really excited to see some local authorities that are involving the community in this as well. I think that'd be really interesting perspective.
One of the other points I'd make is that it's really helpful to have some of your senior leaders involved in the discussions. So thinking, is there an opportunity to involve an elected member in the wider workshop? Who needs to hear this? Who is it important to? Who are you trying to influence? That's the question to ask. Okay.
So just, some comments there about
timescale. Timescales are extremely tight. Easter and May holiday weeks will impact on availability. Is there scope for extending this to mid-July? For you, Chris, I think.
So, I mean, the short answer is no, and as we've sort of talked about, and that's partly because we need to get on with this, and partly because of the fit with this, with the wider programme evaluation. So it's really important that we've done our best to get as many stakeholders engaged in that summary by the end of June. So it's not flexible, but obviously you've got to refresh at the end of February, and you've got to make it fit your own timetables and what have you. So if you've got partnership board meetings that can't fit you in on the agenda for that timeline, or they're not meeting, they meet quarterly or something, you might have to find other ways to actually engage with those partners and have those meetings and have that discussion at workshop meaningfully, so that doesn't become a barrier. So sorry, Lynn, bring the Easter eggs to the workshop, but not on Easter Day, and so do all you can to get as meaningful engagement as you can.
Okay, a question here from Vicky Wild. What will the turnaround time be for closure of the online survey to EIF, returning the data to the coordinator? This will have a big impact on scheduling. So we have committed to send the data to you within 5 working days of your 21-day period for completing it. So you will have it within a week. Next question from Suzanne Wright. What is the deadline in June? If this is a 10-week process from setting up the online survey through to returning results to WP, this is quite tight to complete by end of June, given that we're in April already. Chris?
Yes, it is. Again, we've been talking about this for a few months, but of course what we're finding is that some of you are getting involved a little bit further down the line, so it is making it feel like a real squeeze for you, and I do totally understand that. I go back to my original answer. There isn't any squeeze, unfortunately, on that deadline because of a number of reasons, but I do understand. We've tried to design this comprehensive process for you to follow. We know it's tight, but we know that you can make it meaningful and work for you. So sorry, I can't say yet, just forget that. And I know it's tight because some of you are only just picking responsibility up for this. So that's kind of how that's come about. But do talk to your regional integration lead and get ideas for how you can speed that up and be more efficient so that you're not squeezed too much by the end.
Yeah, a couple of suggestions for you in responding to that. We've allowed 21 days for you to complete the survey. If you only need 2 weeks, generally we offer a 2-week period when we're working with local areas on our other matrices, but we wanted to leave sufficient time to make sure we weren't cutting off too soon. So if you want to abbreviate that process, then get in touch through the RPC inbox and say we would like our deadline day to be this day. That could save you another week. Again, we would commit to send you your data within 5 days of the date that you say. You may find that you can find other ways of abbreviating the process if you line up your stakeholders right at the very beginning for the workshop and leave yourselves a little bit less time in between getting the data from us and running your workshop. Again, we've been relatively generous with the amount of time that we've allowed. It is tight, as you've been pointing out and as Chris has been saying, but there are ways that you can save a bit of time in the process if you need to. So Julie Neal asks, can we see the questions in the online survey to help us decide if we want to go with the survey plus half day or the whole day event? That's a really good question. We haven't made that available yet, but we will do. I think that's a really good idea. Essentially, it is built around the planning tool, so it works through each of the 10 key elements, asks respondents to say at what level they would rate it, so between 1 and 5, asks them what evidence they have to support their rating, and then asks them to describe what actions they think need to be taken. So, but we will make that available. I can see how that would be helpful for you to decide. Jill Baller asks, there is little knowledge about this programme in the local job centres. How is this being communicated to our DWP colleagues?
So, good question, Jill. I know there has been some communication. So, in newsletters and email communication that goes out to staff. But what I'll do is I'll take your point there and make sure that there's as much information as possible to colleagues in DWP. Yeah.
Jane Egan asks about a link to the hub. We will certainly do that. You can also see a link to the hub in the slide at the moment. So the bottom bullet, although that takes you to a particular part of the hub, it's within the hub itself, so you can navigate that way. Alternatively, you can go to the Early Intervention Foundation website and search hub, and that will also take you to the RPC hub, but we will send a link as well. Jane also asks, I feel that we are between entry level 1 and 2. Would we be better aligning ourselves to 1 rather than 2? Is there any advantage or disadvantage to selecting the entry level? That is an excellent question, Jane, and a common experience that people find they're a bit of level 1 and a bit of level 2, and in one particular small place, they're level 4. It's not an exact science. It's not actually about the numbers. Although it does give a sense of the progress level, it's really about the discussion. So it will be for you to decide how you score yourself. Some areas, well, most areas actually tend to be cautious and to score themselves down, what we generally say is don't go for the higher level unless you are confident that you meet it in its entirety. So just because you might have a small scale example that illustrates the higher level, if it doesn't feel secure and across the whole of the area, or picking up all of the points that are in the descriptors, then don't score yourselves at that level. But in the narrative that you use to describe your local story, it's fine to say we're level 1 and 2, and lots of places score themselves as between both levels. In your response to DWP, you have to pick a level. Okay, next question from Claire Bell. Can the coordinators go through the online survey before other stakeholders so we know what will come up and how to help? Yes, you can. I guess that will be part of your 2-week, your 3-week period, the 21 days. Alternatively, as we were just discussing, we will make the online survey available so you can see what it covers. It's fairly straightforward. If you're familiar with the planning tool itself, then you will already have a good feel about what it covers. So there's no, they're connected. It's the same thing, really.
It's not a complicated survey in that sense. Julie, you've picked up about the timeline again. I think it's worth you chatting to your regional lead. I'm not sure from your questions where you're from. But get in touch and you can discuss in a little bit more detail how we can help to sort out what you need.
Okay, Jane, another question from you. Those undertaking the survey will return directly to DWP, so how will I know if there are any outstanding? Will you inform me of who has returned? Actually, the individual responses don't go to DWP. They come into EIF. We don't pass that information on to DWP. We only pass it back to you once the 21-day period is up. You won't know from us how many are outstanding and whether people have done it. But what I would suggest is that you prompt people. You could ask people to let you know when they've completed it so that you can do some targeted chasing. I'm afraid we can't go into each set of returns and let you know who's responded. So I think you would need to find a way to do that locally. And Julie, we have local elections next month. PERDA may need to be considered in the planning timescales, especially as the focus of this stakeholder engagement, just a thought. An important thought, Julie. Do you want to comment? We've kind of covered this already.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to take into account what's going on for your own local area and adapt to it. As I say, there's no particular movement we can make on the deadline because of the number of other connected factors and dependencies. So we just have to try and work around it and help you work around what's going on for you locally. Sorry, Julie.
We've got some more questions now. One from Sonia Bassi in Cheshire East. As we are doing a sub-regional approach, can the person we appoint as coordinator register for the 3 local authorities that are working together? That's not a question we've been asked before, actually. As I understand it, the system is designed around individual local authority responses. That doesn't stop you from running your stakeholder workshop with others if it helps to collaborate. In terms of the process that we've set up, it's built around each local authority registering and responding. I guess you could choose to adapt the information that you submit to us or to DWP. What I would suggest is that you talk to your regional integration lead about that. From our perspective, it's a relatively automated system. So we will send you a link and we will assume that it's for an individual area, the link to the SurveyMonkey survey. If you then choose to share that with stakeholders from across 3 local authority areas and collect a broader set of information to use, you could do it that way. There's nothing in the system to stop you doing it that way. I guess you might lose some of the information that's particular to individual authorities, although you would have the individual responses. So it might just, you might need to spend more time analysing the information, the data, when you get it back. But there's nothing in the way that we've set up the system to stop you doing that. And clearly you can run a wider stakeholder workshop that's focused on a sub-regional approach. I guess it's perhaps something for DWP to comment on.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to say that even where a number of areas across England are collaborating, so in terms of the output to us as DWP, the summary does need to reflect each area. So we don't want one report for a number of you that are collaborating. You'll probably just need to nuance each one, but we do need a separate return where there's a contract. So there's this is part of the contracted output, if you like. But if you've collaborated on them and a lot of the content is similar and reflects those areas, then that's okay. So do talk to your regional lead. We want it to make sense. We want it to make sense to you and not create lots of work. But we do need a separate summary for each of the areas, even if you've collaborated on your journey to get to it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So yeah, do just chat about that.
Another point from Sonia: can we have a list of suggested people to invite to complete the survey? Fine. Yeah, that's straightforward for us to do. We can talk a little bit more about the kinds of stakeholders that you'd want to involve, and also how long does the survey take to complete? It takes about 30 minutes. Obviously, some people will take a little bit more. Some people will whiz through it. It depends on how familiar they are with the issue, and also how much free text they want to include. But generally, it will take people no longer than half an hour. There's also a comment that's come through that having an email template would be very helpful, and it really helped with some previous work around consistency of the main messages. So a plea for us to create one of those. Again, that's fine. That's straightforward for us to create, so we'll do that.
So Julie Snell is talking about, can we use other events and other surveys that we're doing, an activity at the time, to populate the online tool. And again, Julie, I think you need to, I'm sorry, Juliet, I can put glasses. Again, Juliet, if you talk to your regional lead, you might get a little bit more nuance on that. It sounds like a great idea, but because we're talking about, or you want to talk about a lot more other things than simply parental conflict, you might end up asking people for whom it's not really relevant discussion in terms of the online survey. So talk to your regional lead and you can get a bit more advice as to what's appropriate. But in principle, getting some community input to this, I think would be really, really exciting to do. So,
yeah, and again, in the way that we've organised the online process, there's nothing to stop you sitting down with a group of stakeholders and working through it in a guided way. And in fact, people have done that previously for other matrices. That's a good way of getting community involvement because you have a guide. I guess the only flip side of that is to make sure that the guide is facilitating rather than guiding too directly. So that it's frank perspectives from community members rather than another way of confirming what the organisations think. Yeah, I think the key thing to remember though is that the online survey is not the answer, the set of answers that you're looking for. It's simply a way of preparing for the workshop. The most important thing is the discussions that people have face to face, to understand this agenda, to talk and listen to each other, and to build consensus. That's the crucial part of this, which is why the workshop is part of both strands of the process. Julie Neals asked about my point about not knowing who's completed the online survey or not, and could you invite more than 10 to 15 stakeholders to participate? Yeah. You can invite as many people as you want, but just to be aware that our experience shows that too few doesn't help, but nor does too many. Actually, the 10 to 15 stakeholders is based on work with local areas where there is some chasing, and previously we have provided feedback on who's completed it and who hasn't. So I think that's a good point, that it may be wise to invite more so that you allow for some drop off.
Would it be fair to say that not everybody will answer all questions?
Definitely.
So again, if you have invited a few more, you may target some of those questions or some of the domains at particular people. So again, for example, if you are talking to communities and families, you may want them to ask a few particular questions rather than giving them this whole sort of big thing to complete. So some of the people, some of the time.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I guess you could do that if you think that it's helpful in building that fuller picture of what's going on in your local system. So there's nothing to stop you doing that. I guess my question would just be whether you were limiting the opportunity for people to comment on things where they would have an opinion. But there's no expectation that people have to make up an answer for something you just don't know anything about, and it just feels too technical. So it's down to your judgment, I guess. Vicky Wild asks, does the online tool reflect the new council boundary for BCP Council as opposed to Bournemouth and Poole separately? I don't know the answer to that, but we will check. I suspect it might not. So a couple more.
Juliet, we've answered already. So.
Yeah, so a question from Sylvia in Haringey. What is the EIF conference for in June? That's on the thank you slide.
What a great question to end with.
Yes. Most of you haven't seen our thank you slide yet. And there it is. Fantastic. So, yeah, Sylvia, thanks for pointing it out. We are intending to run a couple of events in June, towards the end of June, the 25th and the 27th. So the 25th in London and the 27th in Manchester. Some of you may have been involved in some conferences that we ran last year in March. These are the follow-up events to those two, where we will look at parental conflict and what's happening at a local level. We will share best practice from pioneers and champions. We will run a series of workshops to help you understand what people are doing and how to respond to key issues, including getting strategic leadership right on this agenda, exploring innovation in terms of digital responses, looking at NHS-focused responses that are about alcohol and parental conflict, and a whole host of other really interesting things on this agenda. It's also an opportunity just to connect with other people who are working on this agenda, to network with them, to share ideas, and some reassurance, I suppose, that this is new for a lot of people. You know, lots of people are on the journey. No one has cracked this yet, but there's some really exciting things happening. So definitely worth registering for those. You can find them through our website, which is listed in this slide. They're full-day events. Last year they were only half-day, but this year we're brimming with content. So please book through our website.
And who should attend? What sort of person are you expecting there? What sort of level? Is it quite practical? Is it theoretical? Is it a mix?
It is a mix. I guess it's people who are taking a lead on this agenda at a local level. Actually, this agenda is a mix of both strategy and practical approaches. So some of the things that we talk about are practical ways of engaging your workforce, and some of the speakers are in very practical roles. But inevitably, this is also about joining up the wider system and making sure that local family strategy takes account of parental conflict. So it's worth having a look at the agenda and making your own mind up. I think it should appeal to both strategic leads and commissioners and people in operational roles. The other point that I would make is that we want to broaden the audience for this kind of event. We commonly receive a lot of interest from people working in local government, including people in public health roles. We're asking you to bring a friend. because we want you to make sure that the key stakeholders that you want to influence at the local level, including people working in the NHS, people working in schools, people working in police, people working in the voluntary sector, we think they will get a lot out of this kind of event as well. It's free, so please do bring a friend.
Great. So I think that's about it.
I think it is. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope it's been useful. We look forward to a continued conversation with you and hope to see you in June. Thank you very much.
Thank you.